Alright, so we're going to continue our discussion of mitosis by talking about one way that it's used in specific organisms. So it is used as a means of asexual reproduction. Asexual means that the single organism can actually make a copy of itself, of the full organism, and then kind of release that second organism into the world to become its own thing. So it's basically making clones of the organism itself and then letting them go. Now, we're going to talk about some of the benefits to this and why some organisms will do this over sexual reproduction, and then also talk about what are some of the negatives that sexual reproduction kind of deals with. Okay, so first up, asexual reproduction. Many organisms will actually reproduce by cell division. Now, this is generally when they are single-celled organisms, so splitting the cell in half is creating a whole new organism. So asexual reproduction is the creation of offspring from a single parent. Okay, so there's no mixing of a genetic code or anything like that. The only genetic code available is that of the single parent organism. So there are a couple different types of asexual reproduction. First up, we have binary fission. So binary fission produces two daughter cells that are genetically identical to the parent cell. Now this is found oftentimes in a lot of bacteria, okay, and some in prokaryotes, which includes bacteria. Okay, so this really just happens the same way that we saw in mitosis. Okay, the difference between, there are a couple differences between prokaryotic cells and the eukaryotic cells that we've been studying the most. Remember, in prokaryotic cells, they don't have organelles, so they don't have to worry about splitting those. They also have one giant piece of DNA, okay? And it's usually circular, but it kind of ends up getting tangled up on itself when it's in the cell. But it doesn't have a nucleus, so that is why you see it just kind of hanging out in the middle of the cell in this depiction here. Okay. Now, asexual reproduction, this binary fission, allows bacteria to reproduce rapidly. So if you've ever had a bacterial infection, you know how quick you can go from feeling pretty good to just feeling miserable. Okay, and that's because of this binary fission, because the bacteria is reproducing and just kind of spreading out so quickly. Okay. Let's go back a second. Okay, so this is really the preferred mode of reproduction in bacteria when the environment is friendly to the bacteria. So if the environment has enough food, if it has enough space, bacteria will go into binary fission mode. They can fill up space incredibly quickly. So I've got two videos that kind of show this. One is just looking at a standard binary fission happening in bacteria, and it really starts with one or two cells, and then you see how quickly it can kind of explode out from there. The second video starts off with asexual reproduction, and then we'll go and switch into sexual reproduction. And so that leads us into this. Some organisms can undergo either asexual or sexual reproduction, and it's the environment that determines what type of reproduction is the most advantageous. So like I said with the bacteria, if it's a friendly environment, if there's enough food and space, then the bacteria really don't have to compete for anything. Okay, so they want to fill up as much space as possible. They're growing, so they want to divide, okay, or else their cells are going to get too big. Now, if the environment becomes less friendly, okay, in order to survive, the status quo, what the bacteria have been doing, isn't good enough. Okay, so the bacteria have just been making exact copies of themselves and releasing those exact copies into the environment. But if the environment becomes less friendly, say if there's an antibiotic introduced, then all of a sudden bacteria have to be able to adapt to their new environment. The easiest way to do this is to actually start willy-nilly combining genetic information, right? Because each little bacteria cell, they're not perfect copies, okay? There are a couple mutations here and there, and by doing sexual reproduction, those bacteria can basically accumulate those mutations and eventually find something that helps them survive in that unfriendly environment. So the video that has the 4-foot by 2-foot petri dish, and they explain the different levels of antibiotic, is showing that to you. They don't necessarily come out and say the different types of reproduction that are happening, but when at the very beginning of it, when it's got no antibiotic in the petri dish, those layers, that is when those bacterial cells are undergoing asexual reproduction. Okay, and you can see how quickly they spread through that very friendly environment. But then they reach the point where the antibiotic level increases. Okay, so now it's a less friendly environment. So they undergo sexual reproduction. They find a mutation that works to avoid those antibiotics. Okay, and that's where you see the new colonies start to form in that second band. Okay, and it's pretty drastic when it happens. Okay, but once it finds that advantageous mutation, then it will go back into asexual reproduction, because now it's a friendly environment again. Even though the antibiotic is there, it's not harming the bacteria to the point where it's an unfriendly environment. Okay, and then when they reach the next increase, they go through this switch again. So asexual reproduction is advantageous in consistently favorable conditions. It's very quick, it doesn't take a whole lot of energy. You can make a bunch of copies in not that much time. Sexual reproduction is an advantage in changing conditions. It provides genetic diversity. And what we found over the years is that genetic diversity is actually really important for, healthy organisms. So one of the reasons that the endangered species list is so vital and so important is because once a population of a certain organism, certain animal, goes too low, there's not enough genetic diversity to keep that population healthy, okay? Because then that population starts to become inbred. And we have seen what happens with even inbred humans, okay? If you think back in like the 1800s, things like that, when you had all these different royal families. All the royal families said, well, you can only marry a royal to their kids. So eventually, it didn't take too long, but eventually all of the royal families were inbred with each other. So if you only have so many different options for family or for marriage, okay, then it becomes one giant family, and there wasn't enough genetic diversity. And so then you start getting different genetic issues. There was the one family that basically didn't have a chin, okay, and that was one of their genetic issues. There were others where they had developmental issues. All different kinds of problems started to pop up because the families were so inbred. So it's kind of one of the advantages of having that genetic diversity is that you avoid that. We also have seen this with purebred dogs. So purebred dogs, generally their lifespan is under 10 years. It's because in order to be purebred, they are basically inbred. Okay? And then if you get a mutt, generally their lifespan can be up to 15, 16, 17, even higher years. Okay, that's because they have enough genetic diversity in their parents that they are genetically healthy. Okay, and that's why they have a longer lifespan. They don't have as many genetic issues. Okay, so when the environment is friendly, bacteria will reproduce asexually. And when they reproduce asexually, you get what's called exponential growth. Okay, exponential growth is where you have this curved like growth number of bacteria. Okay, so basically, if you start off with, say, 1 bacteria, okay, you go through a single cycle of cell division. Now you have 2 bacteria. You go through another one. Now you have 4. Go through another one. Now you have 8, and then 16, and then 32, then 64, and then on and on and on. Okay, so you can see after the first couple rounds of cell division, you can see it goes up incredibly quickly. Okay, so this is known as exponential growth. Okay, and it's basically just this curve here. Okay, all right. So some eukaryotes can actually reproduce through mitosis. Now, this might seem a little bit weird. There are a lot of eukaryotes that are multicellular organisms. Even some of them can reproduce through different forms of asexual reproduction. Generally, when we talk about reproducing through mitosis, we're talking specifically about single-celled organisms, though. Okay. Now, this has an example of both a multicell organism, the Hydra, and a single-celled organism, the yeast. Now, when we're talking about this, okay, binary fission happens in prokaryotes. Budding, in this case, happens in eukaryotes. Okay, so budding forms a new organism from a small projection growing on the surface of the parent. If it's a single-celled organism, it really just looks like binary fission because it's just dividing in half. Okay, and that's what you see with the yeast here. If it's a multi-celled organism, it's a little bit more noticeable. Okay, with this Hydra, you can see it's got a little bitty baby Hydra growing out of it. Okay, it's as if you basically had a growing human coming out your side. Okay, out from your ribs. Right, that's kind of the idea behind budding here. So yeast, corals, sponges, some worms, some viruses, and several plants can actually asexually reproduce through budding. Next up, we have kind of a weird one. It's called fragmentation. Honestly, I think this is the weirdest of all the asexual reproduction forms, but this is where the parent splits into multiple pieces and each grows a new organism. It's really as weird as it sounds. So starfish will do this. Some species of starfish will do this. So here you can see an arm either gets cut off or falls off of the parent starfish. And then the parent starfish regrows that arm. And then the arm that's kind of hanging out starts regrowing another starfish. It happens. I have a video about some starfish that can do this that mostly just split in half, and then the two halves regrow the other half. Yeah, it looks real funky. Some worms can also do this. Okay, so this is showing, I didn't find this one because that's just really super weird even to me, but this is showing where a flatworm basically gets cut into pieces, and then each piece regrows a full organism. So you have, in the case of the starfish, 2 new organisms from one single organism, and in the case of the flatworm, you have 4 in this case. So molds, yeast, lichens, sponges, corals, and flatworms can reproduce this way. We're going to pause here because I've got under a minute for the last type of asexual reproduction.